Hello everyone and welcome to Green Magic, your source for all things green and magic. Alright, finally the time has come. We're on episode 10 of the Mana Ramp series. This one will just be the other cards. This is just other ramp, things that I either, for one reason or another, didn't just find a place for in the other list. And I do know a couple cards that will show up here kind of do fit in the other list, but I didn't include them for one reason or another. I think a couple of them I just forgot, but they do kind of ramp in different ways. So let's get started right off the gate with Llanowar Druid. It's a 2 mana, including a single green, 1/2 Elf Druid. You can tap and sacrifice it to untap all forests. Now I will point out that it says all forests, so that includes your opponents and all dual lands. It doesn't have to be basic, just all forests. Now you generally don't care about untapping your opponent's stuff. You're the one who's going to benefit the most off of this. And here's the thing. These 3 cards are 3 of the most powerful cards in green. They just are. Now this one has kind of the downside of being an elf, because you might naturally be inclined to include it in an elf deck. But elf decks, generally speaking, want to ramp through elves, not through lands. There are some elves that will fetch you lands, like wood elves, but most of your mana is going to come through the creatures themselves, and so you're going to want effects that untap your creatures. So it's not really an all-star in that deck. But in most any other deck, just including this, if you were, you could untap 10, 15 forest, and if you have mana doublers like a Vernal Bloom, a Zendikar Resurgent, whatever, this one thing will get you 20, 30 mana. And if you happen to have other effects, I mean, obviously the best way would be is if you had a haste enabler. That way you could keep a turn going and you could do everything you need to do all in one turn and just have that explosive turn with where you do everything and win on the spot. But the other thing that can be really beneficial to this is if you have other things that will make copies. Things like Dual Nature or the Minion Reflector and then Bramble Sovereign. Decks, cards like those are incredibly helpful with this, because if you got 2 or 3 Llanowar Druids that can each be tapped, sacrificed to untap all of your lands, that's huge. Also, if you have things like the, Rings of Brighthurst or Illusionist Bracers, things that you can use to copy activated abilities, you can just generate absurd amounts of mana by both using its effect and having multiple copies of it. It's just, that's how you win a game. You close it out and you just generate so much mana that you have that massive turn. And the next card, Early Harvest, 3 mana, including double green. Instant, target player untaps all basic lands he or she controls. Yeah, you can target an opponent if you're trying to do something where maybe you need help against a different opponent and they have an answer, but they need the mana, so you help them untap their lands and so on. But this one is just a spell version where you get to untap all of your lands, basic lands. So this card, same thing. If you have anything, how do I even put this? Suppose you have, like 10 lands out. You've already tapped, some of them to put out your mana doublers, and you tapped your first 4 for a Vernal Bloom, then you tapped your next 3 to get out a Caged Sun. Now you have 3 lands left that tap for 6 mana each, so you tap 2 of them to get a Mana Reflection or a card draw or something, and then you use your final 3 mana for Early Harvest, and you untap all 10 lands, which now produce 3 mana each or whatever, after having drawn cards and gotten all those mana doublers in. You just, in one turn, generate so much value by getting those mana doublers out earlier in the turn and then being able to untap your lands, which now produce so much more mana. This card is, when played correctly, expropriate good. Because while expropriate gives you literal extra turns, a card like this gives you extra turns within the same turn, because you just keep your turn going to the point where it's like multiple turns all in that one turn. It's hands down one of the best cards in green in the format, and I can't believe it doesn't see as much play as it does. I mean, I'll say in a moment why I kind of think that it might not, but especially with mana doublers and a lot of land-based ramp, it's hugely effective. Now, the first comment that I will kind of want to use to explain why I think that it's not, why it's overlooked, is look at a card that we all know is super powerful, Black Lotus. If used incorrectly, that card isn't that good. You could play a land on turn 1, in formats where it's not banned. Turn 1, land Black Lotus, cast Gray Ogre, a 3/3 creature. Technically, you've done a big play. You've done a 4-mana play on turn 1. That's huge. But realistically, we can all look at that and say, you didn't do the most powerful thing that you could in a vintage legal format. You got to use the very powerful cards in a very powerful way in order for them to be very powerful. A Black Lotus can be used in just a foolish and bad way just as well as any other card. Well, Early Harvest and the other two on this right here that it goes with it, if you're not really using it very well, yeah, it's not going to be that strong. But if you've got plenty of lands out and mana doublers, and you've got card draw and effects to really, do the big thing and explode and possibly win that turn, or if you don't have haste or you don't have whatever, at the very least you can just load up the board and all of your opponents have one turn to answer you. When used correctly, this card is crazy powerful. And if you haven't used it, I would suggest trying it. The next card, Rude Awakening, 5 mana, including a single green. This one's a sorcery. You choose one, because it's modal, and untap all lands you control, or until end of turn, lands you control become 2/2 creatures that are still lands. And it has an Entwine for 3 mana, including a single green. I don't think I've ever really considered the Entwine. The only instance where I'd want to, because your lands are now creatures, they would be vulnerable to any kind of board wipe, and they stay creatures. Oh no, that's only until end of turn. But they're vulnerable to board wipes if your opponents have any instant speed things. The only way that I would ever even consider doing that is if I've got like the Nissa ult, where my lands are indestructible, or some other... The Nissa ult, which gives you the emblem saying your lands are indestructible, or some other thing saying my creatures are indestructible. Otherwise, it's too high of a risk, and realistically, even if you have 20 lands in play, is attacking with them going to be your best play? No. The reason why this card is stupid powerful is because it untaps all your lands. And unlike Early Harvest, this one will untap all your lands. So if you have a Gaia's Cradle, a Nykthos, anything that taps for a bunch of mana, it'll untap those too. So this is the card that I was very unimpressed with the first time I saw it. And this is one of the reasons why I underestimated these effects when I first kind of was introduced to them. I was in a game, and somebody else had 8 lands out. They tapped them all. They used 5 of the mana to cast Rude Awakening, untapping their lands. Now, I looked at that like it was just some stupid ritual, because basically all he did was he gained 3 mana. Now, it is possible that he has some sort of game-winning spell that's cost somewhere between 9 and 11 that he couldn't have cast with just the 8, but I don't know why you would include that card in the deck for that reason. I don't think that he used it very well, or that he built his deck in a way that really utilized the power of this card. As I recall, he did not have a game-winning thing. He just did a couple of like a 5 and a 6 mana spell or something, and so the card was completely wasted. But again, just like Early Harvest and Llanowar Druid, if your lands tap for a ton of mana and you've already used it all up and you've used it to cast the mana doublers and the card draw spells, and you've maybe got a ton of cards in hand, but you've only got a couple of lands left untapped, untapping them all and being able to generate an additional 30, 50, 100 mana, whatever crazy amount, that's equivalent to expropriate. You've just given yourself 2 or 3 extra turns that turn. And if used correctly, you should be able to win that turn. These cards are just insanely powerful, and I would definitely put them up as some of the most powerful cards in green. The only thing that I think holds them back from being an always powerful or an auto include or anything like that is that you do have to have plenty of lands out and or a good number of mana doublers in your deck. If you're not doing that, if you're ramping in other ways like mana dorks, or if you're not ramping very well at all, then these cards aren't very good, and because you haven't built your deck very well to use these effects. Your deck might still be good in other ways, but your deck isn't compatible with this. It would be kind of like putting a doubling season in a deck that doesn't have tokens or counters. But if your deck is something that would benefit from these, it will benefit huge from these. Moving on, I've talked enough about those. Cryptolith Rite, 2 mana, including a single green. Enchantment. Creatures you control have, quote, tap, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. So this card sees a ton of play. I understand it, but obviously not every deck would benefit too greatly from this. You would want this in any deck with either a ton of little creatures or tokens, or I guess that's kind of it. If you're doing a big number, if you've got a considerable quantity of large creatures, you're not going to tap those big creatures for mana, and you're not going to have enough little creatures to tap for mana to make Cryptolith Rite a worthy inclusion. So you do want to pay a little bit of attention to what all is in your deck before including this. I would have to assume with how many decks it's in, there's probably a good number of them where Cryptolith Rite isn't necessarily a great inclusion in those decks. But it is overall an obviously good card. Next, Yanggu, Wildcrafter, 3 mana, including a single green. Legendary Planeswalker, Yanggu. It comes with 3 loyalty. Each creature you control with a 1/1 counter on it has, quote, tap, add 1 mana of any color. And he has a -1, put a 1/1 counter on target creature. So, obviously, if you're not playing a deck full of 1/1 counters, counter effects, things that put it on your creatures, then he's not going to be very good, because if you're reliant on him to put the 1/1 counters on your creatures, he can only do that twice before he goes down to 1 loyalty, and then if he dies, then those creatures lose the ability to tap for mana, and then what have you done? You haven't done anything. So this card would need to go into a deck that already has a ton of 1/1 synergies. So whether it's just each creature in your 99 happens to enter with counters, or if you have a ton of instants and sorceries that just say put a 1/1 counter on all your stuff, or however you do it, this will only work in a deck that's already full of 1/1 counters. Next, Earthcraft, 2 mana, including a single green. Enchantment, tap an untapped creature you control. Untap target basic land. So it is worth noting that it'll only untap a basic land. So unfortunately, that doesn't work with your Guy's Cradle or your Nykthos or anything like that. But still, tapping a creature to untap a land is pretty strong and powerful. This card is known for a combo with Squirrel Nest, where That's an aura that you put on a land, and then you tap it to create a token, and then you just tap that token to untap the land, and you create infinite tokens. You can still play this pretty fairly. Obviously, it would go well with any kind of token thing. If you have an effect that says, like, hey, create 10 tokens, and all of a sudden now you can tap those 10 tokens to untap 10 lands and generate 10 mana, or more if your land's tapped for more than 1 mana. So, very powerful card. The one thing that I think is worth pointing out as the benefit to Cryptolith Rite over Earthcraft and the benefit to Earthcraft over Cryptolith Rite, with Earthcraft, you tap a creature as part of Earthcraft's ability. So it doesn't matter if the creature is summoning sick. So if you, again, create all those tokens, you can tap them immediately. Summoning sickness doesn't matter. The benefit to Cryptolith Rite is if someone tries to destroy the enchantment with split second speed, so like a Corrosion Grip type effect, you can always tap the creatures in response because you are allowed to activate mana abilities in response to split second. If someone split second destroyed your Earthcraft, you can't tap the creatures to untap a land. That's not a mana ability. That's not something that can get around split second. So the two different things do have their own benefits in different ways. Overall, usually Earthcraft is better. I guess as far as fulfilling your own game plan, Cryptolith Rite is a little bit better at being defensive, at being able to respond to those split-second removal spells. Next are a series of things that, when they attack or deal damage, you get a land. So with the card draw series, there was a whole video all about things that when they attack or deal damage, they get you card draw. There's not nearly as much stuff that'll get you a land. So starting with Centaur Rootcaster, 4 mana, including a single green, 2/2 Centaur Druid. When it deals combat damage to a player, you may search your library for a basic land card, put that card into play, tapped. If you do, shuffle your library. So, yeah, this isn't a great way to ramp because, 1, he costs 4 mana, then you have to wait the following turn till he is over Summoning Sickness. Then you not only have to attack, but it has to be unblocked. That's not super fast. I guess it would benefit off of Double Strike if you happen to be able to give it Double Strike. But, yeah, it's not a terrible thing to include if your deck is already well suited with ramp and card draw and you're trying to make everything gain you extra value, like your whole deck is everything gives you value. It could work well in that. Certainly, it's just a little bit of bonus value, and if you got a bunch of things that do that, it'll all add up, but not a great source for your primary ramp. Hunting Cheetah, 3 mana, including a single green. 2/3 Cheetah, which should be a ratted to cat, I assume. When hunting Cheetah successfully damages your opponent, you may search your library for a forest card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library afterwards. Oh, so I didn't even realize this one only puts it into your hand, so it doesn't even ramp you. But it does get you a forest card, so it can get you a dual land, or I guess the new tri-land, assuming that it has forest in the typing. Still not a good card. But same circumstance. If you're in a deck where you're just trying to make sure that everything generates value, not everything is going to be highly efficient, and it doesn't need to have everything be highly efficient. All these little things that are less efficient but still get you something are going to add up, and it's just a value deck, and that can be fun too. One with Nature, a single green mana, enchant creature, so it's an aura. Whenever enchanted creature deals combat damage to a player, you may search your library for a basic land, put it into play tapped, then shuffle your library. So obviously, you would usually want to equip this to, or attach it to a creature that's already been out, already is over their Summoning Sickness, so that you can swing right away and get the benefit off of it. That'll at least help you the first turn when you do cast this. But again, you do have to deal combat damage to a player, so whatever creature you attach it to has to have either trample or evasion, or your opponent you have to do it early enough in the game to where your opponent doesn't have a blocker, And since it only costs 1 mana, it is something that you could cast very early in the game. If you have like a 1 mana creature, then on turn 2 you cast this, and you kind of get off to a good snowbally start. It would definitely benefit in a deck like that is able to that's looking to attack right out of the gate, and this will help with that. Obviously, as an aura, it would go in like an aura deck or an enchantment deck. For the vast majority of decks, though, I don't think that it's super relevant or helpful. Worst case scenario, though, if you do cast it and you're able to just swing once with a creature and get just one trigger off of this, it's basically a 1 mana rampant growth. So that's not bad either. So even if you attach it to your creature with trample, swing on turn 4, 5, 6, whatever, it gets through, then the following turn there's a board wipe. Okay, you didn't get much value out of this, but you got a 1 mana rampant growth. So it's not a terrible card. It just isn't something that sticks out to me as something that I'd want to include in most decks. Next, Ranging Raptors, 3 mana, including a single green, 2/3 dinosaur. It has the Enrage mechanic. So whenever it is dealt damage, you may search your library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. So this one, if you're attacking, it needs to be blocked. If it's blocking, it needs to block. Otherwise, there are probably ways where you can build like a pinger deck and you can deal damage to it directly yourself through other means. And that would obviously be the most effective way, because if if you've built a deck that way, then you can just ping your you have probably built some sort of combo where you can ping your opponent's stuff, you can ping your own stuff, which have a variety of benefits to doing that. I imagine, though, the vast majority of people are just playing it fair and honest. They're probably just putting it in a dinosaur deck, and if it gets through, it gets through for 2 damage, no big deal. If it gets blocked, whether it's chump blocked or it's blocked by something bigger, you get a land. So it's not a terrible value, and in a tribal deck, it's going to be on theme. Next, Sword of the Animist, 2 mana. It's a legendary artifact equipment. It has equip cost of 2. Equipped creature gets +1/+1, and whenever equipped creature attacks, you may search your library for a basic land, put it on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. So this goes, because it's a colorless card, it'll go in every color deck. Any color can run it. Obviously, white is going to really want it because they don't have much ramp, and also because there are a lot of equipment-based decks in that color. But you can do it in any color, and it's definitely worth including. It's very low to the ground, and because it's an equipment, even if the creature is attached to 2 dice, you can just attach it to something else and keep the value train going. It's also not usually going to be a high priority target if someone has targeted artifact removal, so there's always that. Then next is going to be Avenging Druid, 3 mana, including a single green. It's a 1/3 Druid. If it damages any opponent, you may reveal cards from your library until you reveal a land card. Put this land into play and put all other reveal cards into your graveyard. I don't like putting things in my graveyard, so something like a Hermit Druid type effect just does not appeal to me. It does not fit in my deck building style. But for a lot of you, this card would be very valuable and would really help your goals of filling up your own graveyard and also ramping you in the process. The thing is, it does need to deal damage to an opponent, but it doesn't need to be combat damage. So if you do attach any kind of equipment that allow it to ping, then you can just deal damage that way and keep doing that safely each turn to fill up your graveyard and ramp and do whatever it is your deck's goal is. Next is going to be Druid's Repository. It's a 3 mana, including double green enchantment. Whenever a creature you control attacks, put a charge counter on this. Remove a charge counter, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Now obviously if you got a ton of proliferate effects, then you can take advantage of the fact that this uses counters, but in most decks this is just going to want you to attack all out every turn with whatever you got. Now if you've got small utility creatures, things that maybe you care about because they do other things, they have tap for other abilities, or they have static abilities or something, then you're probably not going to want to put them into harm's way, which means you're not going to get the maximum effect off this card, so it's kind of a combo there. But if you're just generating a ton of, 1/1 tokens that you don't care about, send them out every turn. Why not? Worst case scenario, they deal damage. Best case scenario, they deal damage. Worst case scenario, if some of them die, but you get mana either way. So this one definitely wants you to do stuff with a large quantity of creatures. If you're going Voltron or just have a few big creatures, if you're attacking with 2 or 3 6/6s each turn, you're not going to get much value off this. You need small things and a lot of things. Sakiko, Mother of Summer. It's a 6 mana, including double green, 3/3 legendary snake shaman. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, add that much green to your mana pool, and it will stay with you until end of turn. So there are very few decks that use this as a commander, which is kind of baffling to me because it's just a straight value. Now, I understand that in the last couple of years, Wizards of the Coast has printed commanders that just give you a full engine stapled onto it. But this is a card that's been around for 15 years, and commanders didn't always basically give you everything you need. Yeah, this doesn't give you the card draw aspect, but it gives you free mana every turn. All you got to do is have creatures swinging, which pretty easy to build a deck like that. This one should be reasonably powerful. It does cost 6, so getting it out, you need to ramp up to it, but once you get there, it should provide you a lot of value, and yeah, you should be able to do a lot of big things with it. Now, one downside that I don't necessarily like two things that give you the mana in main phase 2, even something like a Sword of Feast and Famine, which untaps all your lands, and so you spend that mana during main phase 2, is that if you're building a deck that you can get a bunch of creatures out and then you can get a haste enabler, then you would want all that stuff to happen during main phase 1. You would want to cast everything in main phase 1 and the chance of hitting that stuff so that you can swing and end the game right then. If your deck doesn't have a lot of haste enablers, if you're just, whatever, then it's not much of a downside to have to cast a good chunk of your spells in main phase 2. And so you just want to make sure that how you're building your deck is going to take that into account. You're not looking for haste. You're not looking for combat buffs. You could, so that you swing in with an overrun and then you have more mana during main phase 2 to cast other stuff. But you need stuff. You need a deck that you're not overextending in main phase 2 and then praying that it all survives till the next turn. You do need to, just kind of be careful with how you do it, because if you're overextending after combat's already been done and then you build up this huge board state and then a board wipe happens, it was all for naught. So probably something where you'd want a combination of power and damage to get the ramp, and then combos or other non-combat ways to win in main phase 2 if you want to have a more assured victory. Next, Mark of Sakiko, 2 mana, including a single green, enchant creature, so it's an aura. Enchanted creature has, whenever this creature deals combat damage to a player, add that much green to your mana pool, and it will stay with you till end of turn. So, Sakiko, Mark of Sakiko, pretty self-explanatory where this card came from. It's even from the exact same set, and this one, as an aura, it only affects 1 creature, but you can at least get it out a little bit earlier because it only costs 2. Same thing though, the mana happens in main phase 2. So next is going to be Veteran Explorer. It's a single mana, green, 1/1 human soldier scout. When Veteran Explorer dies, each player may search their library for up to 2 basic lands, put them onto the battlefield. Then each person who searched their library this way shuffles it. So this one, as a 1-mana creature, can get you 2 lands. The lands don't come into play tapped, they come in untapped, but it applies to all of your opponents as well. So upside, downside, it's something that you're going to have to think about whether or not you really want to benefit. Obviously, because your opponent's benefited off of it too, it's pretty easy to get it to die, even without sack outlets, just by swinging away and being like, hey, this 1/1 that's coming at you that you can easily kill with a bigger thing, you're also going to get lands off of it, so please kill it. You know, it's not difficult to get it to die. Next, Viridian Emissary, 2 mana, including a single green. It's a 2/1 Elf Scout. When it dies, you may search your library for a basic land, put on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. So this one costs 1 mana more, it only gets you 1 land, and the land comes into play tapped, but only you get the land. So that's more often than not going to be beneficial and worth it. Next is Seedguide Ash, 5 mana, including a single green, 4/4 Treefolk Druid. When it is put into a graveyard from play, you may search your library for up to 3 forest cards and put them into play tapped. If you do, shuffle your library. So this one does not say basic, so you can get 3 dual lands if you'd like, but as a 5 mana 4/4, you do that you need to die. I don't know how much I like this card. It was not too long ago featured on Tolarian Community when the professor, I believe it was the professor and Emma were arguing about their underrated cards or overlooked cards or whatever, and I believe the professor named this card as one that he feels is overlooked in Commander, and I don't see it. I mean, it just, you need to lose a 5 mana 4/4 creature in order to get the value off of it. So that's just not really what I'm looking to lose. I mean, it's kind of worth it. 5 mana to ramp 3 lands is definitely good, and you know, that's 1 extra mana but 1 extra land compared to like a explosive vegetation. The Nissa's whatever, that's 6 mana, gets you 3 lands and gains 7 life. It's 1 mana cheaper than that. It's just, it's not a terrible value, but to then lose a creature that's a reasonable size too, I'm not in favor of it. It's not for me. Next, Primal Druid, 2 mana, including a single green, 0/3 Human Druid. When it dies, you may search your library for a basic land, put it on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. Now, what stands out to me here is that Viridian Emissary is in 2,500 decks, and this one's in 670. They're both 2 mana, they both get you 1 land into play tapped when they die. So the Viridian Emissary has more power, so if you happen to have, you know, some sort of combat trick where you're buffing up all your creatures and you swing out, he'll do a little bit more work than Primal Druid. The Primal Druid has a little bit more toughness, so he can, you know, block off like a 2/1 Viridian Emissary. So why is there such a huge difference? I have to imagine it's the creature typing, because Viridian Emissary is an elf. It probably is seeing play in a lot of elf decks, but why the hell would an elf deck want your elves to die? Those usually want you to have a lot of elves on the battlefield, which you then pump up and swing with. Getting them, you know, sacrificing them is not really what you do there. The only explanation I can come up with, and it's a good reason, is how they work with Skull Clamp. Viridian Emissary has 1 toughness, so Skull Clamp it and it dies, which means that you draw the 2 cards off the Skull Clamp and you get the land off of the Viridian Emissary. Primal Druid won't do that automatically, so with that sack outlet, which isn't literally a sack outlet but kind of is, yeah, Viridian Emissary works with that better. But chances are, whatever deck you're playing these in, you're going to have multiple other sack outlets, like some of those black creatures that say, you know, when it enters, every player sacrifices a creature, or you're going to have things like the altars, you know, sack a creature for either a color mana or 2 colorless mana. You're going to have a bunch of sack outlets, so these should see play in basically the same decks at the same frequency. I don't get why Viridian Emissary sees so much more play, but it is what it is. Gotta move on. Awakening Zone, 3 mana, including a single green. Enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may put a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token onto the battlefield. It has, quote, sacrifice this creature, add 1 colorless to your mana pool. Then there's From Beyond. It's 4 mana, including a single green. Enchantment. It's devoid, so it's not a green card. At the beginning of your upkeep, put a 1/1 colorless Eldrazi Scion creature token onto the battlefield. It has, quote, sacrifices to add a colorless mana to your mana pool. It also has the ability, pay 2 mana, one of which is green. Sacrifice this. Search your library for an Eldrazi card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. It's weird to me that Awakening Zone is in 1,200 more decks than From Beyond. Now, I do get that as a 3 mana thing that is intended to ramp you versus a 4 mana thing, that is a difference, and it does matter. It's somewhat relevant. But both of these would they're not replacements for like a Cultivate or an Explosive Vegetation. These things belong in primarily token decks. You're looking for a lot of token doublers and stuff like that. And if that's the case, there's no reason to have one and not the other. So I imagine that most of the decks that From Beyond is in, that From Beyond is in, also have Awakening Zone. And there's a ton of overlap for the most part, and there should be. Also, if you happen to be doing anything with Eldrazi, then both of these are appropriate to that tribe. From Beyond, though, should see more play within an Eldrazi deck because of the ability to tutor up an Eldrazi. Now, obviously, if you are playing an Eldrazi as your commander, then you can't play either of these because they're both green or have green in the color identity. But if you're playing a green deck that just is full of Eldrazi, it's Eldrazi tribal, effectively, then, yeah, these should both see play. What's worth pointing out, too, is the From Beyond is 1/1s versus 0/1s, so they are a little bit bigger, and that kind of makes up for the extra mana cost to cast it. Maybe that's worth pointing out. I don't know. Moving on, we're going to talk about Carpet of Flowers. It's a 1 mana, green. It's an enchantment during... Okay, so this one's been errated. I'll try to explain it, both what's on the card and the actual text. During your main phase, you may add up to X mana of 1 color to your mana pool, where X is the number of islands target opponent controls. So the way that this one works is you choose which main phase this happens on. It doesn't happen on both of your main phases. So what could happen, like if you play it on turn 1, is, you play your land for turn, which is going to be a forest. You tap it, you cast this, you move to combat, you move to main phase 2, then you say, hey, my opponent over here has 1 island, so I get 1 mana. You only get it for 1 main phase or the other. You have to choose, and then obviously everything else is self-explanatory. You get X mana of whatever color. This one sees a lot of CDH play. I understand it's pretty good as an early game turn play, but it doesn't speak to me. I've got a few copies of it. I think I have it in 1 or 2 decks, so I think I have like 2 copies that are just kind of floating around. I'm not big on it, but I do understand why it's powerful. It just isn't the type of power that I'm looking for. Moving on, Elemental Resonance is a 4 mana, including double green enchantment aura. You enchant permanent at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase. Add mana equal to enchanted permanent's mana cost to your mana pool. So this is a card that I actually kind of want to go in depth on because I think that there's a lot that could go into how you use it. So let's look at a board state. You are looking to cast this card. You're wondering what to do it on. Now, your instinct would be to look at your own stuff and say, I'm going to enchant one of my things, and I will get that much mana each turn. Your first choice would probably be Ghalta, because it is a 12 mana creature. You'll get the most mana off of it, but that's usually not going to be the best choice, because not only would it be higher up, not only would that increase its priority as a target for removal, but it's a creature and any board wipe will kill it. So maybe you would choose the Impervious Great Worm. That one has Indestructible, so a board wipe, at least a destroy board wipe, it'll survive that. It'll still increase its priority as single target removal, though. So that's not so good. Because it's a creature, there's obviously going to be there's more creature removal than anything else. So that's kind of a downside. So you might be looking for other card types. So right there you got Nylea, which is an enchantment. So enchantments are the least likely thing to be destroyed. It goes creatures, then there's a lot of artifact removal, and then enchantment's a little bit down. And especially enchantment board wipes are the least common. You won't see that very often at all. But Nylea happens to also be a creature, usually, depending on your devotion. So now it won't be just, it's safe from any creature-based destroy board wipes, and it's safe from any enchantment-based destroy board wipes. But exile creature, exile enchantment, it's vulnerable to each of those. So maybe you don't want to cast on that. Well, your only other choice for your stuff is the Planeswalker, which there's not too many removal spells that target Planeswalkers directly. And then there are, a small number of things that'll allow you to destroy any permanent. But for the most part, Planeswalkers are the least likely thing to be destroyed under most normal circumstances. But Planeswalkers can be attacked directly, so it is pretty vulnerable there. So the thing that you might need to do is to look at everything else, because you can enchant your opponent's stuff too. That's when you notice that there's a Rhystic study in the top right-hand player's playmat, and you kind of are wondering, why aren't the other guys dealing with that? That's a Rhystic study. Why is it still there? So maybe you think to yourself, is it that they haven't prioritized it for some reason? Do these guys just not know what they're doing? If that's the case, maybe I can put this on there, and either it will draw their attention to it so that they are now incentivized to get rid of the Rhystic study, because it currently would be drawing that player cards and ramping you mana for as long as it stays up, which maybe that's enough to incentivize the other two players to want to get rid of it. Next, you could look at that same player's Yarok. Now, this is one where I envision a scenario where that player maybe has a board wipe, but they're electing not to use it. The reason being, or the thought behind it is, even though the other player's board states are very scary and they've got big things on there, he may have less of a board state and is naturally incentivized to board wipe, but chooses not to on the grounds that he needs his commander, or Yarok, because of the value that'll generate him on his following plays. He's not willing to part ways with it. He'll stare down all the other stuff, but he won't get rid of it. He won't pull the trigger on the board wipe because of what he sees as value there. By enchanting that, either it's going to stay safe because that guy is not going to get rid of his own thing, or you kind of nudge him in the direction of pulling the trigger on that board wipe. Now, there's no guarantee that he'll do the board wipe. So if he doesn't, chances are he either doesn't have it, or that he has other ways of dealing with the other problems that won't necessitate a board wipe. For example, he might have things like Acidic Slime and Meteor Golem and things like that he's looking to use to pick off the other threats. So your aura, which will ramp you, is safe on his thing, and part of the reason that it is safe is because he's taking care of the other things, the other threats, in a way that doesn't destroy everything. And the same mentality would be kind of true if you were to look at possibly attaching it to Ulamog. That person, maybe they have a board wipe, but they don't want to do it because even though their board state isn't, massive, the one thing that they have is very important to, or very strong in what it'll get done in the immediate present. It's not their commander, it's not the center of their game plan. But if they had an effect that exiled all creatures, that's something that they're not going to get back. It's not going to the command zone. Once it's gone, it's gone. So if you were to similarly attach it to like the Ulamog, then that person would maybe be a little bit more incentivized to pull the trigger on their exile all creatures, because they don't want to give you 11 mana every turn. And then next, you want to you don't think that a board wipe's coming, but you do kind of want to ensure that whatever you attach it to will survive. So you think that there is a targeted removal of some kind. Well, at this point, you kind of want to look at where to put it. If you put it on your own thing, then you have 3 opponents that might have a removal spell to destroy your own thing, like the Galta or whatever. But if you attach it on one of your opponent's creatures, they're not going to destroy their own thing, so you only have the other 2 opponents who might remove that creature. In this case, you can see what I believe the other player's priorities would be. The player in the top right, he's probably going to be most worried about the Ulamog because of Annihilator, and he doesn't want to lose his stuff. His second biggest priority would be, Gisela, the thing that will double damage to opponents but have damage to himself. That would be a big threat to that top right player because, one, obviously all of that player's creatures are dealing extra damage, but so both the bottom left and the bottom right are incentivized not to attack that person because their damage will be halved. Instead, they're incentivized to attack either each other or you, the guy in the top right. And it'll deal double damage. The third priority for you would probably be the Galta, just because it's a big trampoid thing, and if the Gisela happens to still be out, maybe it's hexproof for whatever reason you can't get to it, 12 damage, trample, and if it deals double damage because of that other card, then that's a threat. The Savala is not on your list. If you have targeted removal, you're going to leave the Savala alone. Similarly, the player in the bottom right-hand corner, their number one priority would probably be the Gisela, the thing that deals double damage, because same reason, it incentivizes the other 2 people to come after him, and it makes it hard for him to attack the player in the top left. Number 2 target would probably be Yarok, just because he knows that Yarok generates a lot of value, and that person, the person in the top right, is probably going to have stuff that, like a Reclamation Sage, which can get rid of his Citadel. He's going to have stuff that maybe can steal creatures, and it's going to steal his Ulamog, or, there's going to be a lot of value that he could be afraid of there. And then the third thing would probably be the Nylea, just because it both discounts my stuff, and also it will, if I have the mana, which I probably do, it will also allow me to potentially get some card advantage if I have creatures on top of my library. The Savala, one, it's not going to draw that person any cards because there is a 16/16 on the battlefield. And 2, it's with the current board state, at least what we see of it, it's only going to tap for 5 mana because that's his biggest creature. And it costs 1 to activate, so it net 4 mana. And then it would only generate me 3 mana. So it's not a priority at all. So in this sense, you've kind of protected it a little bit by just putting on something that isn't a big target. So if all of that is something that appeals to you as far as gameplay, if you want to really look at a board state and make those kind of assessments, then you might be drawn to wanting to play a card like this. And any number of other things that are highly interactive and really make you view the game in that way. Also, it would be good in just, an enchantment deck or an aura deck. It'll at least get you some value there. But I wanted to go a little bit more in depth on that one just to kind of demonstrate what might be going through your head when playing a card like that. And then the last one in this frame is Sakura-Tribe Springcaller, 4 mana, including a single green, 2/4 Snake Shaman. At the beginning of your upkeep, add green to your mana pool. It stays with you till end of turn. So if you want a mana dork that you don't have to tap for mana, here's an option. It exists. That's about all I can say about it. It's a 4 mana dork that you don't have to tap for mana, so it's not a high value. The reason why you would see this in any deck is snake decks. From that era, that series, those sets, there were a handful of snake commanders, and at least a couple of them cared about snake tribal. They wanted you to play snakes. So if you're playing snake tribal, this just goes in the deck because it's part of the tribe. And even though there are a few snake legendary creatures that want you to play snake tribal, I don't think that there's a huge number of snake cards. So you're going to have a little bit of a shallow pool to choose from. And obviously, you're not going to have a ton of great cards. So at least this one does something and can generate you a little bit of value. But not a great card, but does fit in that tribe. Moving on, Frontier Siege, 4 mana, including a single green. Enchantment. As it enters the battlefield, choose Khans or Dragons. Khans is at the beginning of each of your main phases, add double green to your mana pool. Dragons says, whenever a creature with flying enters the battlefield under your control, you may have it fight target creature you don't control. So, the thing about this card, which sees a decent amount of play, is that you do get 2 mana in each main phase. So the turn you play it during main phase 1, you at least get 2 mana back in main phase 2. Thereafter, every turn, you get 4 mana. It costs 4 to cast it. It's a good value. I am just not a huge fan of it because it does split the mana up in 2 different phases, and because I don't know, I just look at the other cards as maybe ramping me in a little bit better way. Even though an Explosive Vegetation, which costs the same, will only get me 2 lands, which, assuming there's no doublers, those 2 lands will tap for 2 mana. That's 2 mana per turn. This generates 4. It's less. The Explosive Vegetation, even in that bare minimum scenario, has the benefit of card advantage and thinning the deck. And those lands are also safer too. They're less likely to be destroyed, either by targeted removal or some incidental board, enchantment board wipe. So it's a good card. I can totally justify including it in a lot of decks, but I don't think that it's really as good as some of the other things. Also, what I don't like about it is that it's kind of a standalone card. There's not really anything else that does the same thing. I mean, sure, there's other things like right here that kind of do the same thing or do something very similar, but I'm not really a big advocate of having your ramp package be like, cultivate Explosive Vegetation, then a couple of mana dorks, then like a Wood Elves, then one of these, then, like a Carpet of Flowers. Like, I don't want a lot of different things. The more that your spells are similar to one another, they create a consistency and redundancy that's pretty helpful for making a deck run smoothly. Having, some of your ramp spells be mana dorks, and some of them just give you flat mana in this way, and some of them give you lands out of your library. It makes the deck kind of bumpy and not really for me. But I can't speak against it. It is objectively a pretty good card. Moving on, Eladamri's Vineyard, a single mana green enchantment. At the beginning of each player's main phase, add double green to that player's mana pool. I assume that this one's been errated to say pre-combat main phase, because the next card, Magus of the Vineyard, single green, creature, human wizard, 1/1 creature. At the beginning of each player's pre-combat main phase, add double green to that player's mana pool. So what I don't like about these is that they give all players double green, so that's going to benefit your opponents as well. If they're very color intensive, then there might be instances where they can't use the mana, but usually they should at least have some sort of generic mana cost in their spells, and they can use this towards that. So it's not it's not one of those symmetrical effects where you're going to benefit more than your opponents necessarily. This one is more of a true symmetrical effect where the benefit is likely going to be perfectly equal, and the difference is that you paid a mana to put this thing into play, in a group hug deck or something, sure. Otherwise, I just don't necessarily like either one of them. And then Shizuko, Caller of Autumn, 3 mana, including double green, 2/3 legendary Snake Shaman. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player adds triple green to his or her mana pool, and you get it till end of turn. So, again, this one, like, I've got a deck list built for it, and I'm going to do a group hug. I don't know how effective this card would even be outside of that deck type. It would be tough to make the effect non-symmetrical. You'd have to have your deck list built in such a way to where you can really make, if you have tons of other ways of generating mana and ramping and doing big things, and this is just a way for you to boost out of the gate, then maybe you can make it work, but I don't think that the symmetrical effect will be very great. Next, Into the Wilds, 4 mana, including single green enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land card, you may put it onto the battlefield. So all of these ones care about the top card of your library. So all of them are going to be best effective in decks where you can manipulate the top of your library. Sensei's Divining Top is a very well-known card in Commander that goes in any deck, or could go in any deck. It's a colorless artifact. Sylvan Library allows you to do a little bit of deck manipulation. I'm sure there's several other effects, but without it, this is just a crapshoot. It's pure luck. Do you hit a land or not? If you do, great. You get a little bit of ramp each turn. You got like roughly a 1 in 3 chance of ramping. Otherwise, you just do nothing. So I don't like a card that's not consistent, and this one isn't it. But not terrible card. Next, Nissa, Vastwood Seer, 3 mana, including a single green. It's a 2/2 legendary elf scout. When it enters the battlefield, search your library for a basic forest, put it into your hand. Whenever a land ETBs, if you control 7 or more lands, exile it, flip it. The backside is Nissa, Sage, Animist. It's a planeswalker, Nissa, 3 loyalty. The +1 is reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land, put it onto the battlefield. Otherwise, put it into your hand. The -2 is put a legendary 4/4 green elemental creature token named Ashea the Awoken World onto the battlefield. And then the -7 is untap up to 6 target lands. They become 6/6 elemental creatures. They're still lands. So the front side, the creature side, just gets you a land to hand. That's pretty valuable and good. The back side, once you have at least 7 lands in play, the plus ability is the only part that I care about, because it either gets you a land into play, which is card advantage and ramp, and it comes into play untapped, by the way. Or if it's any spell, it goes to your hand, which is still card advantage. Not card draw, but still card advantage. Like basically the same thing in this instance. The -2 I don't care about. Even the ultimate I don't care about. If an opponent happens to be scared of the ultimate and they're looking to target it because of that, fine, no big deal. You go ahead and target things that aren't important. Meanwhile, I'll try killing you with my relevant creatures. Moving on, Explorer Scope. It's a 1 mana artifact equipment, 1 mana to equip. Whenever equipped creature attacks, look at the top card of your library. If it's a land, you may put it into the battlefield tapped. So, yeah, as an equipment, even if the creature dies, you can just re-equip to something else. Enter the Unknown, a single mana. It's green. It's a sorcery. Target creature you control explores, and you may play an additional land this turn. Oh, Explorer, I'll point that one out. You reveal the top card of your library. You put that card into your hand if it's a land. Otherwise, you put a 1/1 counter on the creature, and then you can either keep the card on top of your library or put it in the graveyard. So this one, I kind of feel like I should have included in the other video about playing extra lands. I didn't, because I primarily wanted that video, or the cards included in that, to be cards that allow you to do it turn after turn, like an exploration. But I did end up including a few cards that that are like sorceries that don't only allow you to do it once. So this one would be appropriate in that video. I just didn't include it for whatever reason. Probably because this one requires you to have a creature, like a target creature, that explores first, and then you can play the additional land. Whereas the two in that video that I did include that were sorceries, one draws you a card and then you may play a land, and the other one just says play 3 extra lands. So there's no condition that you need to wait for. As long as you have the mana in those ones, you can do it. Moving on, Swell of Growth, 2 mana, including a single grain, instant. Target creature gets +2/+2 until end of turn. You may put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield. Same basic circumstance with the last one I just mentioned. I didn't include it in the previous video because this one, you have to target, you're targeting a creature, you're giving them a combat buff until end of turn, and then the put a land from your hand in the battlefield is more of like a side effect, like a, some cards have draw a card stapled onto it. They just cantrip, but it's the other effect is the reason that the card was printed. So too, it feels like with this one, the put a land card from your hand on the battlefield feels like it's just something extra. It's not the main primary effect of this card, but that is why it's in this video, and that's a way to ramp yourself a little bit if you have the land in your hand. Next, Scaretiller, 4 mana. It's a 1/4 artifact creature scarecrow. And it says whenever it becomes tapped, you can choose one. Either put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped, or return target land card from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So this one, I think I did include it in that other video where you put a land from your hand for the first ability. And the reason why I included it in this video is for the second ability where you put a land from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So if you happen to be doing anything with fetch lands or other lands that maybe sacrifice to draw you a card or do something else, or if you have other mill plans and stuff like that, then that's where this one will get you recursion from. Next is Manabond, a single green mana. It's an enchantment. It says at the beginning of your end step, you may reveal your hand and put all land cards from it onto the battlefield. If you do, discard your hand. I am not drawn to this card particularly at all because it requires you to discard your hand, and I don't like that. That is not for me. Next is Terrain Generator. It's a land, and you can tap it to add a colorless, or you can pay 2 and tap it to put a basic land from your hand into play tapped. That is very terrible ramp. I don't know why this is in so many decks. It's horrible. Even if you are thinking that at worst this still taps for mana, so it will do something, you have to be in a really terrible position within the game to ever want to use that second ability, because it costs you 2 mana, plus you tap this land, which would otherwise provide a mana, so it's like a 3 mana. I would say 3 mana Rampant Growth, but Rampant Growth gets you a land out of your library. This just gets you a land from your hand, and the land from your hand has to be a basic. And I don't know how many basics you're playing if you're playing weird utility lands like Terrain Generator. I imagine in a deck with Terrain Generator, you're probably running a bunch of other non-basic lands, and the land you put in comes in tapped. So, yeah, not a good card. I don't know why it's in that many decks. Even if it was like a 10-cent card, it wouldn't be really a good inclusion. So paying a couple bucks makes no sense to me. Moving on, Perilous Forays. This is a 5 mana, including double green enchantment. You pay 1 colorless or generic and sacrifice a creature. Search your library for a land card with a basic land type and put it into play tapped. Then shuffle your library. So the land could be a dual land or anything as long as it has the basic land types. The thing that I have this in a couple decks, and I do like it as a sack outlet and also as a ramp, as a way to ramp, and as a way to thin my deck and get the lands into play and do good things. But this doesn't go in a deck with if you're playing all big creatures, or if you want this in probably a token deck or a deck that wants to sacrifice creatures. And in those decks, it's very good, but just know whether or not it fits what you're trying to do. Next, Silver Glade Pathfinder, 2 mana, including a single green, 1/1. It is a spell shaper, and it has an ability, pay 2 mana, including a single green, and tap it, discard a card from your hand, search your library for a basic land card, and put it into play tapped, then shuffle your library. So Gavin was just talking about this card like 2 days ago in his Good Morning Magic series. He randomly searched for 3 cards on Gatherer, and this was one of them. So he was kind of explaining about how the Spell Shaper, is that what it is? Spell Shaper? Yeah, Spell Shaper cards worked. Basically, you paid mana and tapped them, and then they did an effect that was similar to a card. This one is basically Rampant Growth. By discarding your card, you get to do the thing. Now, what he was explaining was, with a lot of those cards, if the effect is something that you want to keep doing, then it leads to redundant gameplay, turn after turn, where you're not even using the cards that you're drawing, which isn't fun. This effect of Rampant Growth basically is something that you might want to do in the early turns, but later on in the game, you're not going to keep doing it. You're not going to keep discarding the stuff that you actually want to use to keep Rampant Growthing. I could imagine if at some point, maybe later in the game, you have this out, you're top decking, you top deck a land, you could play the land, or you could pay 2 mana, tap this, and then discard the land to get a different land into play, and that will just thin your deck a little bit more so that you're a little bit closer to being out of. Well, you'll still be top decking, but I mean, you'll be closer to getting something that will actually help you to advance yourself. But for the most part, I don't really like this card. It's not for me. I guess, though, if you do also have graveyard synergies and you're looking to put cards in your graveyard for other reasons, things like an anger or whatever, then it does help you there. Next, Frontier Guide, 2 mana, including a single green. Elf Scout, it's a 1/1. Pay 4 mana, including a single green. Tap it. Search your library for a basic land card. Put it on the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. So this one is a very expensive Rampant Growth. It's not a great value, but it is something that you can keep doing turn after turn. And unlike the Silver Glade Pathfinder, you don't have to discard a card to do it. So if you're in that same position where you're top decking, you're kind of mana, you're flooded, or you just don't have anything going, you can still top deck that land, play the land, use his ability, get another land out, so that you'll still have even more lands for future turns to actually do stuff with once you do finally start drawing your stuff. I know I include them in at least 1 or 2 decks where I'm doing a bunch of tap stuff where I just want to tap things, and if I have ways to keep tapping him, copy the ability, actually make his ability somewhat viable, then it definitely can be okay. I do want to say, or I vaguely thought that someone, whether it was Commander's Quarters or it was the Professor, someone else did kind of say that they do like this card as well. I think it was Cure for the Common Game. If I'm thinking correctly, the guy who's trying to build a deck for every commander, I think he kind of liked this card too. This was one that he had good things to say. I think that it just needs to be in the right deck. Obviously, you're not looking for super high mana efficiency, but he does provide utility that you probably want. Moving on, Fertilid, 3 mana, including a single green. It's a 0/0 elemental, but it comes into play with 2 1/1 counters on it. You pay 2 mana, including a single green, and remove a 1/1 counter from it. Target player searches his or her library for a basic land and puts it into play tapped, then that player shuffles his or her library. So this one is obviously good in like a 2-headed giant scenario, and it was included in Battle Bond for that exact reason. I believe it was also included in the Arch Enemy sets. But usually you'll just target yourself, so the ability to target another player is not usually going to be relevant in Commander. It obviously goes well with any kind of counters deck. If you have ways to put more counters on it, even if it just enters with 4 counters because of like a doubling season. But basically, it's got Rampant Growth stapled onto it, which you can activate at least twice without any other effects. But if you have ways to put more counters on it, then you just have access to more and more Rampant Growth. Of course, those rampant growths first cost you 3 mana to get the creature out, so total you would spend 7 mana to get 2 lands into play tapped, which is not a great value. So if you strictly use it that way, not a great card. But if you have +1/1 counter synergies and can reload it and really do big things to recur the value, then it would be good. So hopefully the 9,500 decks that it's included in are people actually using it well. Next, Everbark Shaman, 5 mana, including a single green, 3/5 Treefolk Shaman. Tap it, remove a Treefolk card in your graveyard from the game, so exile it. Search your library for 2 forest cards and put them into play tapped, and shuffle your library. So the forest cards don't have to be basics, you can get duels, but you do have to exile a Treefolk from your graveyard, so you want this to be in a Treefolk tribal deck. There are some Treefolk commanders. You can build Treefolk tribal. I haven't yet personally, but the tribe does exist. This would obviously go in that, but it doesn't have a place in any other deck. If your deck doesn't have, several Treefolks in it, then you wouldn't even consider this ever. Next is a new card, Migratory Greathorn. It is a 4 mana, including single green, 3/4 beast. It has the mutate ability for 3 mana, including a single green. And whenever this creature mutates, search your library for a basic land card, put it in the battlefield tapped, then shuffle your library. Now, obviously, if you're playing Mutate Tribal, then you would want to include this in the deck, assuming that your deck has, green included in it. It's a new mechanic. I don't know how many sets down the road are going to include it. If it's just this set, then there's not going to be a huge support, so you're going to need to grab every mutate creature possible anyway. Because it's such a small mechanic so far, I think the best way to look at this is more as just by itself, individually. Would you include this in a deck without any other mutate cards? Well, if you put this on top of a small creature that you get out on like turn 1, like a 1/1 or something, you do get to buff that creature effectively. So you do get some value relative to the mana cost. But unless that other little creature has an ability, like maybe it's the 1/1 elf that has trample, the 1 mana 1/1 elf that has trample, this could make it a little bit bigger, and that's okay. But for the most part, whatever small thing that you might attach this to, it's not, giving a little bit bigger body is not usually going to matter. And if you mutate this onto a bigger creature, where the bigger creature is on top and you keep their stats, then this is basically just a 3 mana rampant growth, which, why would you want that? I don't think it's a great card. Under most circumstances, it probably shouldn't see much play ever. And if you just cast it as a creature, as a 4 mana 3/4, then you don't even get the ramp ability, and why would you want a relatively vanilla 4 mana creature? It just doesn't make sense. Moving on. Next is Sasea Orochi Ascendant, which is a 3 mana, including double green, 2/3 legendary creature Snake Monk. It has reveal your hand. If you have 7 or more land cards in your hand, flip it. The other side is Sasea's Essence. It says it's a legendary enchantment at that point. Whenever a land you control is tapped for mana, add 1 mana of that type to your mana pool for each other land you control with the same name. Basically, if you are familiar with the artifact that buffs all creatures for having the same name. I'm drawing a blank. I'm suddenly drawing a blank off of that. The Coat of Arms. So if you're familiar with Coat of Arms, think of this like that. So if you have 7 forests, each forest will tap for 7 mana, because it'll tap for its own mana plus 6 more from the other 6 forests. So it's something that's intended to, once it's online, once it flips over to the enchantment side, it ramps you like crazy and it makes all your lands tap for just a ton of mana, because you probably have 6, 7, 8, 10 lands in play. And so that's either 36, 49, 64, 81, or 100 mana, assuming you have no other effects. So this has actually been mentioned a couple of times, including just recently by EDHREC as being on their list of the cheapest commanders to build, very budget. And I know that Jumbo Commander, I saw a deck tech from him like a year or so ago where he built the deck. And I haven't gotten around to it. It hasn't been super interesting to me. I kind of want to, but I just haven't yet. Anyway, yeah, this once you flip it, it just gives you insane amounts of mana. But it is tough to pull off the way that Jumbo Commander showed it, and I assume that most of the decks that are in that budget EDHREC super cheap way of building it probably just have things that get you lands to hand, things like Nissa's Triumph and Gaia's, it's not Gaia's Anthem, it's Gaia's something, I don't know, another 3 mana sorcery that gets you 2 basic forest to hand. Things like that. Personally, what I would probably do is just load up the deck with a ton of card draw, and then you have 20 cards in hand somehow, and then you're like, hey, 7 of these 20 cards are lands, therefore, flip it over, here I go. So that's the way I would do it, but I haven't yet. Next, Life and Limb, 4 men, including a single green. Enchantment, all forests and all saplings are 1/1 green sapling creatures and forests in addition to their other types. So this one is very risky. It obviously wants you to be playing some sort of sapling tribal deck, because this one, you could make your forest into creatures this way, but the way to ramp is to make your saplings into forest. It does mean that your forests are now creatures, and therefore they are vulnerable to board wipes, so you could easily just get crushed that way. Although I suppose theoretically you could have little to no forest, have other ways of generating mana, then just create a ton of saplings, and then the saplings are forests, which isn't going to make them more vulnerable to removal. They already were as creatures. Yeah, that would be a weird way to do it, but yeah, it's usually you're obviously just going to have forest as your lands, and they're going to be vulnerable, so you either need to not care about getting wiped out, or you're going to need ways to make your stuff indestructible. Yeah, this one fits in. This one's very narrow to make it work and not be super risky. I'm just not interested in it personally. Maybe at some point I will. Even in the sapling deck that I have not built but have a list for yet already, I would not include this card. It requires even more of a build around than just being sapling tribal, which I do technically already have a sapling deck. So, which isn't really a sapling deck, but anyway. Lotus Cobra, 2 mana, including a single green. This one is a 2/1 snake. It has landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Now this one, considering that it's one of the very last cards that I'm even mentioning in the entire ramp series, it's a very good one. Very good one. So it's not like I'm saving all the duds for last. This one actually sees a lot of play, and deservedly so. Even if you're not playing landfall, which this one says landfall on it, so it obviously fits in that. But even if you're not playing special landfall, just playing 1 land per turn, that land's going to generate you a mana for entering, and then again for tapping it. If you got, a bunch of fetch lands and stuff like that, then you play the fetch land, you get a mana off of this, you crack the fetch land, you get the other land, you get a mana off of this, then you tap that land for a mana, and you can do big things with it. Obviously, and because it gets you a mana of any color, it goes great in multicolored decks. It's a very good card. So, yeah, I just don't have anything bad to really say about it. The next card, however, is one that I don't like, and I don't think that it deserves the play it gets. Castle Garenbrig. It's a land, and it enters tapped unless you control a forest. You can tap it for a green, or you can pay 4, including double green, tap it, add 6 green, spend it only to cast creature spells or activate abilities of creatures. For as new of a card as this is, that wasn't included in a precon. It just came from Eldraine. Why people are putting this in as many decks as it is baffles me. Because, okay, so you're probably going to have a forest already. Or if this is your turn 1 land, you're playing this turn 1 because you don't have a turn 1 play. So the enter battlefield tapped maybe isn't super relevant. It can at least tap for a green. So assuming you don't have like a Vernal Bloom or a mana doubler that cares about the land being a basic or something, or you're not worried about, cultivation and explosive vegetations not being able to get this because it's not a basic, you would have to draw it naturally. It'll still tap for a green, so maybe you look at it as being as good as anything else with potential upside. Sure. I've already just named potential downside of not benefiting from Vernal Bloom and similar effects. But the upside to it is so minimal because it costs you 4 and tapping it, which it would normally tap for a mana, so it's effectively costing you 5 to give you 6, which is an upgrade, but the 6 can only be used on creatures and creature abilities. So I know I've mentioned this in some of the other RAM videos with the mana dorks. I don't like that effect because how often are you going to be in a position where maybe you need that extra little bit of mana, but you need it to cast an enchantment or artifact or sorcery or whatever. If you have, if with this you could generate 6 mana and that's exactly what you would have, but you have a 6 mana sorcery or artifact or something in your hand that you really need and want to cast, but you can't because this will only let you, do a creature. You would be able to cast a 5 mana instant or sorcery or whatever, but you have a 6 mana one. It is just going to feel so bad and not be able to do the thing you need to do. And with the mana doublers in play, I mean, even just a normal mana doubler, suppose you had like the Zendikar Resurgent, which just it applies to all lands. So this one would tap for 2. So if you need to pay 4 to activate it, and this would tap for 2, then you would be able to generate 6. So the second activation, second ability, gives you 6, but you can only use it on creatures. So as soon as you have a mana doubler that will apply to it, the second ability is negated. And if you have a mana doubler that will only apply to basics, then this doesn't help with it. So you fall behind on there compared to a basic. And the payoff is an ability that will only generate you extra mana for creatures, which is a restriction. I don't like it. It should not see the play that it does. It's one of those things where people see a potential upside, but again, if you're not building your deck with all the other powerful things, yeah, I guess in a deck that's not built to ramp well, then this is an effect that is at least better than literally nothing, but you should be able to do better things. Of course, a lot of those mana doublers cost a decent amount of money, so a $3 land versus, multiple $20, $30 cards, I guess I can totally understand from a budget reason, but at that point, if you're going budget anyway, you might as well just do a budget basic land and, save your money and spend it on other things, even if it's not mana doublers. So the very final thing that I was going to include in this, and I honestly don't know why I made a note of it when I was making this list for this video of all the other mana ramp. Courser of Crucifix, it's a 3 mana including double green, 2/4, enchantment creature, Centaur. Play with the top card of your library revealed. You may play the top card of your library if it's a land card. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. So again, I wrote this one down to include in this video, but then when I went back and was actually going through all the things that would be included here, this was one that I was like, what was I thinking? Why would I include this? I've distinctly not included things that don't ramp you, that don't actually get you ahead. Why did I include this? But even after reconsidering that I shouldn't include it, I've decided to make make a point about it. This card is in a ton of decks, and it shouldn't be. There's no good reason for this to be in very many decks at all. If you are in an enchantment deck, yes, this one with an enchantment in play, with an enchantress in play, you cast this, it's an enchantment creature, so it'll draw you a card. But in any normal deck, this does not make sense. Because look at all the downsides to it. Playing with the top card of your library revealed means that you are giving away information. Okay, well, if you're going to give away information, there better be a huge payoff. Like, it better be worth it. Because that is a huge benefit that you're giving your opponents. You should get an even bigger benefit. Something that's worth it. Well, the second ability, you may play the top card of your library if it's a land card. Okay, well, if it's not a land card, then you don't get any benefit. Suppose it is a land card, but you have a better one, like a Nykthos or a Gaia's Cradle, or maybe the top card is like a island, but you really need red mana, and you happen to have a red mana source in your hand. So there might very well be instances where you could play it, but you don't because you have a better option in your hand. You don't get to play an extra land, though. You just make that your land for turn. So sometimes, occasionally, you get to not miss your land drop and get small card advantage that way at the expense of giving up valuable information. Oh, but it has one other relevant thing. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life. Yeah, that's not going to be relevant ever. Yeah, no. Just no. Unless your deck is full of life gain, or, this could be included partially to support that, or if your deck is built around lands entering the battlefield, like a landfall deck, it does fit in there. But I seriously doubt that there are 16,500 landfall designated decks that are really using this card in a big, useful way. The vast majority of the time, this card is actively working against you. And I would have to assume that a good chunk of those 16,000 people, including this card, probably think of it or look at it as being like card ramp or card advantage. And it's not. It's actively bad. And it's not like it's some super cheap 10-cent card either. It's, $3-4. So yeah, this one just baffles me on so many levels. It's a terrible card. But it's exactly the kind of card that I did not include in this series, because this whole video series is all about ramp, and a lot of the cards that, kind of like the Nissa that I showed just a little bit ago, the one that gets you a land to your hand, that one I included because of the Planeswalker side, which potentially does ramp you. But the front side, the creature part, which gets you a land to your hand, things like that just get you it to your hand where it doesn't ramp you. I did not include those. There are plenty of other ways that you can get card advantage, both in the form of lands specifically like that, or other things that say, look at the top card of your library and put it into your hand or whatever. So, which I did not include in the card draw series because they don't directly draw you cards, even though they do give you card advantage. This one is an example of what does not belong in card ramp or card draw series, because it doesn't do it. It just kind of looks like it does. It's got a facade of giving you benefit. So with that, I would like to kind of end this series. This is part 10 of 10 of the Mana Ramp series, and this video in particular is massively long. I did not expect it to go this overboard. I cannot believe I had this much to say, but all the cards in this one they really are just like an other series. So there's a lot of them, and they're all a little bit different, so I did have to kind of talk about them overall to a much longer degree. But coming up soon, there should be the 11th video of the series, of the 10-part series, which will be just like with the card draw one. It will be a summary, a Cliff Notes version that will show you kind of the best of each category and overall which categories are the best, and kind of what direction I think that you should go in. So thank you for sticking around for this very long, the full version. Especially if you watched all 10, all the way through, then you got the comprehensive, story to everything. And I appreciate you watching. Stay tuned in. Hopefully there'll be even more content that you like and you find value in and that you learn from. I appreciate you being here, and hopefully you found something out of this. So thank you.